There we go.
There we go. Okay. Well, welcome, folks, to the inaugural Climbing Science Cast with Brian Rigby.
Hello.
And myself, Tom Herbert. And this is episode 1, protein. And we thought this would be the best place to kick off, since by far this is the most talked about topic, or rather the most asked about topic. And basically, the point of this podcast is really to share some information for you in terms of diet and nutrition and performance and all things climbing science, but based on science and not really just opinion.
Right.
Before we get started on that, Brian, who are you and why are we doing this?
So I'm Brian Rigby, and I've been working with climbers and with athletes in general in a sports nutritional capacity for the last few years. I have a Master's of Science in Nutrition. I'm a certified sports nutritionist. A couple of years ago, I started writing a blog, climbingnutrition.com. That's sort of taken up the majority of my free time. But one thing that you don't really get with blogs is this nice conversational aspect where you and a friend, in this case Tom, can converse about topics, and I think kind of dig into some details that don't come up naturally through writing. So I'm excited to use this as a forum to actually explore these topics, and hopefully not just nutrition related, although my background is definitely stronger than nutritional sciences, but I'm looking forward to getting into some training science and just the science of climbing in general. What makes climbers good? What makes climbers fearful? Etc.
Sure.
So, sure. Tom, how about you? What brings you to the table?
So I am by far the least educated here, but I actually came. I originally started as a house DJ and did sound engineering, but as fate takes it, I ended up doing. I'm a full-time GNU Linux system administrator, but over the last number of years, I've qualified as a personal trainer, as sports nutritionist, and really have just delved into as much as I can the science and performance of sport in general, but climbing in particular. So I run a coaching practice under the title Useful Coach, and it was through various chat rooms and or rather Facebook groups that I came across Brian and his rather brilliant blog, Climbing Nutrition, which really fills in the gap in the kind of sports science or nutrition science in climbing. And this podcast is, or this webcast is the child of a couple of conversations. Now, what is interesting about this project is that Brian and I don't know each other that well. We certainly do not spend, or we haven't spent hours preparing for this show at all.
That's true.
and I think we want to keep it that way. So the purpose is that we're both coming at this from the same angle, and that's being the science and looking at the research. But the other angle, to be honest, both of us don't really know. We don't know where the other person's coming from. We don't know the experience of the other person. So it should be interesting listening, because we really want it to be a conversation between the two of us, where we not only fill in each other's gaps, but learn from each other and hopefully communicate to you guys and leave you with some questions and give you some solid advice on what you can do to improve your climbing performance, recovery, injury prevention, and all things.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And as Tom said, I think it's kind of a neat part that we don't know each other that well. We're probably going to disagree at times, but that's good. Healthy disagreement is a natural part of scientific discourse. It's how we, take ideas that aren't fully fledged and maybe develop them into hypotheses to test. But the greater hope is that we'll take that disagreement and maybe find the common elements translate it into something that is applicable to you.
Yeah, and the big thing for us is we really want to balance this between being grounded in the science and giving you enough to actually stimulate some thought. And we're going to be passing you in the show notes and maybe annotations. We'll pass you the papers that we've looked at if it's on something specific, so you can go read it to yourself. And we want your feedback. We want to know whether or not it's too technical or not technical enough. But the other thing is we want it to be practical. It's all good from Brian and myself to sit here and talk about metabolic pathways. That's not so useful if you're going to Greece for a climbing trip. So, anyway, on that note, before we end up just waffling on, this is the first episode. So this is episode 1, protein. So just to give you an overview of what to expect on this inaugural episode, we're basically looking at, we want to describe to you what protein is. We want to explain the recommendations to you. We want to look at composition or why this is important. We want to look about timing and quantities. We've got some stuff on whether it's alkaline acid, basically a summary of everything. But to be honest, both of us don't know how this conversation is going to go. We have a timer, which I haven't actually started. So whoever's listening, you've just got an extra, 15 minutes. So Brian, let's kick it off. Maybe the first question is like, explain, what is protein?
Well, as you had mentioned, protein, the reason we chose protein is because it's just such an asked about topic. On my site, I solicit questions, and the majority of them are about protein. And I think part of the confusion with protein arises because it is an energy containing nutrient. It's like carbohydrates or fat in that you can derive energy from it, but it's not really used for energy, or it is fat. So on the one hand, we have it as part of our dietary recommendations. You have to get X number of calories per day, and a certain number of those should be from protein. But then on the other hand, you can do things with protein that you can't do with fats and carbohydrates. You can overeat protein without putting on fat. You can overeat protein and maintain lean muscle mass. These are things that aren't the same, that aren't typical of carbs or fats.
Sure. And I think the other thing as well is that a lot of people, when you talk about protein with them, they immediately think about it being for repair and recovery, right? So they talk about it something for muscles. But you have thousands of proteins in your body. Proteins are not just structural components like contractile fibers in your muscles and part and parcel of your tendons and ligaments and things like that, but also they're there to form the backbone of hormones. Like insulin is a peptide hormone. They're also incredibly important as enzymes. So enzymes are there to catalyze reactions millions of times quicker being present than they are. One of the things that people have got to realize is that even just from a dietary intake is when you're consuming protein, in terms of the quality of protein, you are supplying basically the building blocks of your entire body and the chemicals and the precursors and everything that's bundled together to keep you running. So from a protein point of view, it really is far, far more than just thinking about supplying enough protein to build muscles.
Yeah, it's true. Protein is in everything. Even our bones are protein, mineral fortified proteins, but without the protein there, it'd just be what? Calcium. That's not a very strong substrate by itself. So you need protein for everything. And when we talk about athletes needing more protein than other people, it has to do not just with muscle, but supporting all of these systems that potentially are going to be overworked. A good example that I always think of is endurance athletes, like runners in particular. Anyone who has this pounding activity on their feet or possibly other limbs, I suppose, they're constantly breaking down red blood cells through hemolysis, and it takes protein to build those back up. And so most sports nutritionists recommend that endurance athletes have at least as much as a strength athlete. Even though they aren't necessarily going to be building the same amount of muscle mass, they have greater protein needs nonetheless.
Sure. And the other thing as well is that people would have probably heard the term mitochondria. So these are the power houses. This is the prime means by which you generate the energy currency in your body. This is ATP, but we'll cover that in another podcast in more detail. These mitochondrial proteins are important, right? So if we don't build the building blocks for those, you can actually be in an issue with energy generation or transfer. The enzyme thing is an interesting thing. There are some diseases where the enzymes aren't working. So there's a disease called McArdle, where you can't store or generate glycogen or break it down. So you had an energy deficit there. So this is a reason why we wanted to start with protein, is because this really is, apart from this is the building blocks of your metabolism. You could think of it like that, the foundation of it. The other macronutrients like carbohydrates and fats provide the fueling, and then when we look at the micronutrition and in terms of vitamins and minerals and things like that, those are the precursors to the chemical reactions that bundle this all together and keep everything going. So, Brian, do you want to explain, since don't worry, do you want to give a little bit of an overview of, let's start here in terms of when we talk about the recommended daily allowance. This is often listed everywhere. This is listed on food labels and things like that. And we'll probably repeat this a number of times as we go over the different podcasts. But do you want to just give a little overview of things like the recommended daily allowance, what that actually means, maybe the upper tolerable limit and stuff like that, just so people get an understanding of what the terms are?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about the recommended daily allowance, protein, at least in the United States, and I'm sure it's similar in the UK and the rest of the world, but it's 0.8 grams per kilogram of protein, or 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. And for those of you in the US, a kilogram is roughly 2.2 pounds. So that's like, I think it's 0.36 grams per pound of body weight per day. This is actually pretty low, though. This was developed for a sedentary population, as were all of our nutritional needs. It's not designed for an athletic population. Athletes, as we mentioned already, have a higher need. So unfortunately, because the RDA is set for this kind of like general population and not for athletes, there's not an official number. But the ones that are most frequently cited are between around 1.2 to 2.2 grams per kilogram per day, or I would recommend maybe closer to 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram per day, which in practical terms is about 100 to 160 grams per day, compared to a general population of maybe 40 to 70 grams per day.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, the good definition of the RDA is, or rather what I put in my notes here, when we talk about protein, right, in this terms of this 0.8 grams that was decided upon and has been set as basically this is representing the minimum level of protein that is required to avoid deficiency.
Right.
And that would
for
be
97.5% of the population.
Exactly. So, and this actually leads us nicely on. And for those listening, if we're throwing around numbers, don't worry, we're going to go back onto this again and give you some practical guidelines for this. So don't get too worried about the specifics of the numbers, because we live in the real world. We don't walk around with calculators, and most of you don't know what your lean body mass is and things like that. So the idea of this cast is to give you some science, but also to give you the practicalities of how this works in the real world. So when we talk about like a deficiency in protein, so in terms of the RDA, we're avoiding that, and that's the avoidance of a deficiency that would lead to muscle loss. right?
Right. Well, not just muscle loss, just protein loss in general. Because yeah, when we talk about deficiency in protein, you can't actually be deficient in protein by itself, because protein is just a source of amino acids. And specifically, there are 9 essential amino acids that we have to get from our diet. Our body cannot synthesize them itself. And so when we talk about a protein deficiency, what we're really referring to is a deficiency in one or more of these essential amino acids.
Right.
So I think worldwide, the most common deficiency is leucine, but that's probably not of too great of concern for most of our listeners, because when we encounter these leucine deficiencies, it's usually in cultures that have a very strong emphasis on a certain staple crop, such as sweet potatoes, that just happen to be leucine deficient. Most people that live in developed or developing countries have enough access to other foods that are richer in leucine that's not a common problem. And in general, I would say protein deficiency in most of the developed and developing world is not a problem. It's really relegated to these impoverished places where they really subsist on a single staple crop that just does not happen to have the right amount of a certain amino acid.
Right. So I think the last number I saw that was that the average American diet was about 1.6 grams per kilogram per day.
Yeah, I think that's true, and that's actually I think it's kind of funny because so many people, when they hear my recommendations for protein, which again we'll cover a little bit later, but their first instinct is, oh, that's so high. But the reality is, compared to what so many people are already eating, it's actually lower. I recommend eating it in a different way, but compared to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, it's considerably lower, especially considering the higher than normal weight that many Americans sit at.
Yeah, and this is an interesting thing, right? And this is why when we talk about protein, it's a hell of a lot more interesting than what you would think it is. Like just even because when we're looking at things, yeah, certainly a lot of us would be reaching this 1.6 grams per kilogram quite easily. But there is eating protein and there is using protein, for the want of a better word,
right?
Or rather understanding why. Actually, here's a good segue. So let's think of it like this. Why is the composition of protein? Actually, let's start right from the beginning. Brian, let's start. Can you explain to us, so what is protein in the simplest sense?
In the simplest sense, it's a source of amino acids, which are then going to be used by the body to build new proteins, and also some di and tripeptides, some smaller molecules that we don't consider as proteins, but are in fact created using amino acids.
Right. So, and the other thing is that, as you alluded to earlier, is that we have there are some amino acids that we need to get from our diet, and some amino acids that we can actually either have be produced or they're byproducts of other things.
Right.
And this is where it gets interesting with protein. So just as an aside, protein is not only a source of energy, as we said, and it's also not only a source of the structural components of various proteins. So if you can think of it like this very easily, you have amino acids, which are the simplest units. They join together and they form these chains, and these chains become more and more or longer and longer. They attach to each other, they fold over, and they become in a specific shape, and this forms a specific protein that does a specific job. And what's incredible about it is that if proteins are misaligned, or if there is something missing, or one of the amino acids is swapped around, the proteins don't work how they're supposed to do. But going back, what is also incredible about protein, or rather amino acids, is that they are also signaling molecules.
Right.
And one of the most important things about protein, and it answers the question of why somebody, let's say this so-called average American, they might be eating more protein than even recommended for athletes, but they're certainly not healthy and it's not optimal. So here's a question for you, Brian. Could you explain why, or let's do this. Can you explain really a little bit of the signaling part of protein?
Yeah, absolutely. As you mentioned, it works as many of these amino acids work as signaling molecules, and I'm sure that there's more than just leucine, but I think for the purpose of our discussion, leucine is probably the most important one, especially when we're talking about athletes and climbers and muscle growth and recovery. When we break the protein down into amino acids and then absorb them, we are looking for a certain amount of leucine, because like any signal, you can say it very quietly, or you can yell it, and the louder the signal is, the better transmission you get. So when we think about protein, we need to get a certain amount of leucine to make sure that that signal is heard at its optimal volume. And many Americans, if you eat too much protein during one meal and not enough during another, what essentially you're doing is you're making too large of a signal. It just plateaus. You don't get the same benefit out of it after a certain point. So, one meal, you have a lot of wasted protein. It's just basically going to be oxidized for energy or even excreted whole in the urine or, elsewhere. And then on the other hand, you have these meals, often breakfast, where you don't have nearly enough protein to cause this signal. And so you end up, throughout the day, you have a couple peaks where you're getting ideal signal amplitude, and most of the time, though, you're sitting too low. Yeah, so when we talk about like how much protein you actually need in a meal, which I think is a better way to look at it at the end of the day, because we can say, oh, if we took that number of 1.6 to 2.2, for me that would be like 120 to 160 grams of protein. It's pretty clear that if you had a single meal with protein in a day and you had 160 grams of protein, that's not optimal. You're not going to get very good results out of that, right? Yeah, you want to split it up, and so the question becomes, how much do you want to split it up? 3 meals a day is pretty typical for, I think, a lot of people around the world, but is that optimal yet? We don't know. And the best way I think we can figure it out is how much protein, high quality protein we're talking about here, how much protein does it take to get that maximum signal? And what the studies have told us is that it sits somewhere around 20 grams of high quality protein for most people, which, if you want to translate it down to the amino acid, leucine, that we're talking about, it's about 1.5 grams to 1.7 grams of leucine in a single meal.
Right. So I'm going to reiterate it again for those listening to kind of make it a little bit more, to summarize.
Please do.
So there is a process in the body, or in terms of a molecular cascade, that will tell proteins to be built, right? And what we've seen in the research is that there is a certain amount of leucine, if we're looking at it specifically leucine, that will turn on this molecular cascade, which will initiate the building of proteins. So for this podcast, we're specifically, when we talk about protein synthesis, we're going to be talking about muscle protein synthesis.
Right.
Because this really is what the main bulk of what we're doing with protein. The other things like collagen protein and things like that, and the building of that, this is part and parcel. But in a general sense, there is a reason, as Brian pointed out, that you wouldn't want to consume all your protein in a single meal. And that is because what we've seen from research is that there is a threshold, or rather a kind of a switch, that once our body has enough leucine, the switch gets turned on, This molecular cascade happens, and the processes that kick in to build and repair protein in the muscles start, and they can carry on over a space of 5 to 48 hours. But what we do know is that once this switch has been turned on, consuming more protein or putting more leucine into the mix doesn't switch the switch on anymore. It is a switch, it's not a dial. So what we understand is that here's two scenarios. You will not eat anything the whole day, and then you have a massive steak at the end of the day that gives you, let's say, I don't know, it's a massive steak. So let's just say 100 grams of protein, right? At that moment, when you consume that steak and your digestion breaks down that steak protein into the constituent amino acids, and those amino acids contain leucine. And for that 100 grams, you're looking at, I don't know, maybe 10, let's say 10 grams of leucine.
Mm-hmm.
Your body only needs between 1.5 and 2 grams of leucine to turn this switch on that will tell the body to start building protein, right?
Right.
For your repair. So what happens is that once the switch is turned on, and also leucine being the switch, but the other constituent amino acids are the building blocks for protein, your body starts going about in this repairing process. But it's rate limited. It can only do as much as it needs to do. And certainly once this switch, this leucine threshold has been hit, it doesn't need the extra leucine. So
right.
What happens really is that you end up using the proteins, or using rather the amino acids in other areas, of course. But they will get to a point where your body is like, I don't need these amino acids. They don't provide me anything. So what I'm going to do is either going to use them for energy, which would be expensive energy in, say, comparison to carbohydrate. And I mean,
it is, yeah.
I mean, in terms of if you want energy from a potato versus energy from a sirloin steak, you go for the potato. And so what is the reason that we talk about spreading protein, as Brian has alluded to, is that we know from research how much leucine is in a high quality protein. So something like a dairy protein, meat protein, some vegetable protein, but you're looking at more isolated proteins from vegetables, which we'll go into in a bit. Is that if we know that there is a threshold for this leucine which turns on this muscle building or muscle repairing mechanics, it's far more optimal to see if we can turn this mechanism on multiple times, rather than just turning it on once and maxing it out and then basically wasting the rest of the protein. So
right.
Yeah, carry on, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, you plateau. It doesn't get much higher after that. It's not a flat plateau. You get maybe a tiny bit more, but really after 20 to 25 grams of protein, you're just wasting it. And so the question becomes, how do you keep it up there? Because it's going to start dipping. You're going to use those amino acids. You're going to oxidize them, and their levels are going to fall in the blood. But it's not as simple as just keeping a continual supply. Because then you could just eat protein all day and it would have the same effect as splitting it up. You want to let it fall to a certain level so that you can peak it again. And you want to so in the end, you want to maximize how much time you spend at those peaks and minimize the time you spend in the valleys. But you can't eliminate the valleys, because then you just end up with, again, a lot of protein waste. You're just oxidizing too much. And this is where I think things get a little interesting and a little clouded in the science, because it's kind of an understudied area as far as why, essentially, if you think about it, when we get this maximum signal, our muscle cells become what some people call protein full. It's, if you imagine a bag, you can't stuff any more protein into it once it's at its limit, or stuff any more marbles into it, or whatever you're thinking. It has, each cell has its own physiological limit of how much of these amino acids it can hold, these building blocks to build more protein. And then it essentially closes the top off. You can't put any more in. How long does it take before you can do that again? And that's what we don't really have a terribly clear answer to. I mean, we have an idea. It seems from the little research we do have that it takes maybe around 3 hours, plus or minus a half an hour. But we don't know what else influences that. We don't know what role other hormones like insulin play in that. So this is, I think, an area that when I think about how our understanding of protein is going to change between this year and 10 years from now, this is the area that I expect to see the most from. And for climbers, maybe this isn't, like the most critical question. Certainly, like bodybuilders who are trying to maximize the amount of lean muscle they can put on, this is maybe a little bit more interesting of a question for them, because, if you can shorten that period, it's called the refractory period. If you can shorten it down to 2 hours or 1 hour, then you effectively increase the amount of protein you can consume in a day, right? Because if you have 3 hours between every meal and you assume that you're going to get, the maximum amount of protein that is effective in that meal, 20 grams, and we're going to assume that you're up for a normal amount of hours every day, that you're not, staying up 24 hours straight, then we're talking about a maximum of about 120 grams of protein effective dose that you can get in a single day.
Right, and I think that's the important thing for people. Before it starts sounding very kind of esoteric, this is very much in terms of the practicalities layered on top of some very cool science. So there is a different part of this which we haven't actually spoken about, and that really is not having enough protein. So they've looked at studies where they've taken the same amount of protein and given it in doses of 10 grams every hour or something, versus giving it 20 grams split, or giving it in boluses of 40 grams. And what they found was, and this is how we understand that this 20 to 25 grams of protein elicits a maximal response, this muscle protein synthesis response. That's how we know that, because they've done studies to look at this.
Right.
But as Brian says, is that the practicality of it is that you're only going to have. So if we go back to the first thing we said, is that we understand that there is a certain amount of protein that we want per day, and we've got this rough number up to about 2 grams per kilogram per day. In the reality of that, how you split that over the day is really dependent on how big you are as a person. If you are a 55 kilo female climber, trying to get a maximum, or rather a minimum, of roughly 20 grams of protein a day is going to look quite different to you in terms of how many meals you can have, versus, let's say, a 100 kilo powerlifter. That 100 kilo powerlifter has a lot more protein to play with, meaning he has a lot more meals he can spread it over. So in terms of the actual practicality of it is, don't worry too much about the science of this and what we're talking, but rather see it as once you know how much protein you have to shoot for per day, you want to try and divide it up into meals that are going to be sensible for you. And the only caveat being is that you want to try and hit this minimum of roughly 20 grams of protein, rather than having small meals. So let's take it into something a little bit more practical. If we're looking at eating 3 whole eggs, we're looking roughly 18 grams of protein. Now, I would say that that's not enough. I would rather, if I was working with a client, I would say, if you want your 3 eggs, I would like you to have it with something else. So it can be some bread to try and bring that protein content up, or better, maybe a third of a tub of cottage cheese, or maybe some other cheese, or something where you look at trying to hit, let's say for this lunch meal, hit this target of roughly 20 to 25 grams of protein. Because you know then, from that meal, that contains enough leucine, as we spoke about earlier, that is going to drive that meal to drive this muscle protein synthesis for the next 3 hours, right? You've known you've hit that target. If you were to just have a breakfast of a couple of biscuits and a cup of coffee, in a sense, that meal, or that opportunity rather, has been wasted for your recovery, because you're only going to get like 5 or 6 grams of protein. And here's actually a question for you, Brian, is how, because I don't actually fully know this, how quick, say we were to be consuming these small biscuits of 5 or 6 grams of protein, how many could you eat over a space of, let's say, 4 hours? Would you get to a point where you have enough circulating leucine and then MPS is triggered?
I think that it would depend on the type of protein in it and how quickly it's broken down. My gut instinct is to say that if you're consuming anything over 4 hours, it's going to be very hard to get the benefit from it. Because either it's going to be a really rapidly digested and absorbed protein like whey or pork. You're gonna, zip up your plasma amino acids are gonna zip up, but then just as quickly decline before, your next meal or infusion or whatever you want to call it. Or it's going to be a slow digesting one where it's going to take, an hour, let's say, to get that peak. And then if you have another meal, an hour later, well, then you're going to have to wait an hour before that next peak occurs. And that's plenty of time for the amino acids to either be used or oxidized.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, obviously, when we eat, we don't consume food instantaneously. But I think that if we're talking about getting enough protein in a meal, we have to provide this loose definition of what a meal should be. And I would say you need to get all of that protein in less than an hour's worth of time.
Right.
Regardless of digestion of that protein.
Yeah. So for the listeners, in terms of the practicality of this, is that this is where you should be aware of what proteins you're using in the meals that you're creating, and to use something like FitnessPal or Chronometer or one of these tools to look at one of your meals, or rather all of your meals, and see whether or not you can reach, whether or not the meal that you're consuming is going to give you this 20 grams of protein. Now, the caveat being, don't think that other foods don't contain protein, right? So
right.
Say you're having these 3 eggs, right, that contain 18 grams of protein, and you're going to be having some toast, or you're going to be having something, right? Look at that and factor that in to what's going to reach. So don't become too paranoid that your protein has to be 20 grams of, let's say, meat protein, right? You will do it. But the difference is that where we find the highest levels of the amino acid leucine tends to be in animal proteins and dairy and things like that. So that's why they are called particularly anabolic, because they are easily providing you this leucine that is going to trigger it. It doesn't mean that you can't do it from vegetables, but if you are doing it from vegetables and you are either in a vegan, vegetarian diet, you're going to have to look at the foods that you're consuming to reach this 20 grams of protein. And what was I going to say? Oh, so Brian spoke a little bit about the digestion rates. Now, this is where it becomes quite interesting, because we can actually take advantage of these digestion rates. And Brian, do you want to talk a little bit about why it would be useful to have a slow digesting protein before you go to bed?
Well, yeah, it is interesting, but I also wonder, at the end of the day, the practicality. And as you're talking about with this before bed, which I'll discuss in just a minute, I promise. But this idea of slow digesting proteins, certainly there are instances where I feel like the investment costs, like it's small. You might as well do it. there's no reason not to do it, I guess. If you have the ability to do it, you might as well do it. So when we're talking about like before bed, having a slow digesting protein, a protein that is going to cause a slower peak in your amino acid levels and then a very slow decline in them, then that is overall probably a good idea, because you're going to have you're going to maintain your body in an anabolic state, a growth state, as opposed to a catabolic state, which is this state of loss, losing muscle, but really losing anything. We can say anabolic is whenever you're building something, catabolic is whenever you're losing something. And when we're talking about athletes, you want to be building, because that includes recovery. So if you have a slow digesting protein before bed, then you'll stay in an anabolic state for slightly longer, which is it's a good thing when we're talking about sleep, because that's the body's number one time for catabolism. You don't eat for usually around 8 hours while you're sleeping, and most of that time is spent degrading muscle protein in order to keep your blood sugar stable. So if you can prevent any of that, that's a good thing. But as I said, I think it's a little more complicated. It's a little tricky, because I wonder about the practicality, because we also know that with the quick digesting proteins like whey, you end up with a sharper spike, so slightly greater for a small period of time muscle protein synthesis. And when we compare what we call area under the curve for a quick digesting protein like whey, which will have this area that's equally sharp high and then drop off really fast, versus like casein, this very slow digesting protein, where it's spread out like that, the area under the curve is the same, or roughly the same usually, which indicates that you get about the same benefit as far as muscle protein synthesis goes. So the question is, throughout the day, does it really matter that much? Probably not. Does it matter before bed? I don't know. Like I said, it doesn't cost you anything to choose a slower digesting protein, whether that's like a whole food, like some legumes or a cut of meat, or whether you choose a, supplement like casein. It doesn't cost you anything to choose a slower digesting one. And it might have some benefits just down the line as well, as far as like providing an alternative energy source for your body. So, but whether that'll make a huge difference, I would say if you have a quick digesting protein like whey in your cabinet, and you don't have a slow digesting one, you don't need to freak out about it. You don't need to worry that you're losing something. But if you have both, or you have access to a slow digesting protein, then it might be worth using that slow digesting one before bed.
Sure. So to bring it back to the practicalities, and this is the thing, is in terms of the relativeness of this. So fundamentally, what we're trying to do here, and the reason that we're going on about this, is that we're trying to put you as an athlete, or even as a hobby climber, right? If you do any activity, I call you an athlete.
I do too.
is we want to be in this position where we're putting positive net protein. So think of it like this: if you don't eat anything for a week, you will be in a negative protein balance, because your body will be breaking down the proteins into the amino acids to do what it needs to do with those amino acids, either for energy or to use them in other places. Mm-hmm. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to optimize your body to be in a net protein benefit, in a positive protein balance.
Yeah.
Right. So if, for instance, the purpose is recovery and training adaptation, right, which is what you're going to be doing. So you want to be getting stronger, and you want to increase the quality of your muscle tissue and the quantity, relatively speaking. Then you need to be in a positive protein balance. You can't just be in balance, which is what that earlier number was, that 0.8 grams per kilogram per day. That's putting you in a balance. That's preventing you from being deficient. But the harder you're training, the bigger you are as a person, the more stress you're putting on your system, that protein balance is going to be skewed in a different direction, which is why sports nutritionists have come up with figures that are more than double the RDA, right? So we're looking at this 1.6 to 2 or 2.2 grams per kilogram, right? Is that because we want to put you into, or you rather want to be in a positive, can't seem to say it, positive protein,
right.
because we want to be repairing the tissues, right? We want that availability.
Yeah. And building them. And I feel like this is one of the areas that for climbers in particular, where maybe some confusion arises, because, you know, climbers, they don't want to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger. You know, they don't want to be gigantic. They don't want to be a bodybuilder. And I think a lot of people worry that if you have too much protein, or if you have protein as we recommend, that's what's going to end up happening. Sure. But protein by itself doesn't build muscle, right? Because again, if it did, then all these Americans with their 1.6 grams per kilogram body weight diet protein, they would all look like bodybuilders, but that's clearly not the case. Protein is only the materials. And in order to use those materials, you need to provide the stimulus, and the stimulus is exercise. And it's only stimulates whatever muscles you're using. So if you're training like a bodybuilder, you know, if you're lifting a bunch of weights in that hypertrophy zone and you're working your entire body and doing these compound lifts that are multi-joint and really doing the most you can to try to just accrue muscle mass, if that's your goal, then, and then you eat that much protein, then yes, absolutely, you will gain protein all over the body. You'll get bigger and, you know, and goal accomplished. But if you're training like a climber, if the majority of your time spent exercising is on the wall, and the times that you're not on the wall and training, you're campusing or, you know, doing some supplementary weightlifting in muscles that are useful for climbing, then those are the muscles you're going to develop, right?
Exactly.
So,
exactly. And it's very much relative to what you're doing. So
yeah, exactly. So when we talk about requirements, it's the same between a bodybuilder and a climber and a runner, because they all have the same stimulus, right? They all need the same amount of protein to get this peak and then maximize the recovery and maximize the protein accrual within the muscles themselves. But they're stimulating different muscles, and those muscles have different potential for gain. I mean, it doesn't matter how hard you work your forearms, they're never going to get to be as big as your thighs. They're just different muscle groups. But if you want to maximize the strength that you can develop in your forearms through size, then you need that amount of protein, that 20 grams of high quality protein, or, you know, mixed amounts of slightly larger amounts of mixed quality protein in order to maximally develop them.
Exactly. And remember, our protein requirements are based on our kilogram body mass. So now we're going to do a podcast on training. We're going to do a podcast on strength to weight ratio. We're going to do a podcast on strength and hypertrophy training. So don't worry about that. We're going to cover that. But the thing with climbing, right, is very briefly is that your stimulus is quite similar, right? If you are bodybuilding, you're wanting to increase the size of your biceps, you're going to progressively overload your biceps with heavier and heavier weight, right? That heavier and heavier weight is going to stimulate the muscles to grow to hypertrophy, and you are going to increase in size, and so your protein requirements are going to go up as you gain weight, right? Your lean body mass is going to be bigger, so you have to provide more protein to maintain balance, or rather positive protein balance. So the difference is that if you look around your climbing gym and you look at your climbers, you know that your bodies are not changing to the degree or relative to your training. Your training adaptation is you are getting stronger, but you're certainly not walking around with absolutely jacked lats and biceps. And the reason for it is it's not necessarily because you're not eating enough, but rather you are not actually stimulating yourself in the same way a bodybuilder would be, because you're not progressively overloading. You're doing more volume. But anyways, this is another topic.
Right, exactly. It's a different type of stimulus, and you only develop your muscles in the way that you stimulate them. But circling back to what you said, this is, I think, another kind of interesting idea about whether like your protein needs requirements do actually go up as you get bigger. Because now this is the difference between like doing a nitrogen balance study and some of these more recent studies, which are looking at maximizing muscle protein synthesis. So we know from nitrogen balance studies and as well as indicator amino acid oxidation studies, basically these are a type of study that are used to determine how much of a particular amino acids we need in order to not waste protein. Because if you're, if you think of it as a chain, if you're missing even one link, you can't make a complete chain, right? You need the right amount of every amino acid in order to form a complete protein. You can't form it if you're missing even one. So these studies tell us that the bigger you are, the more muscle you have in particular, the more protein you need in order to maintain muscle or a positive nitrogen balance. But these studies were also done in ways that, according to what we've learned more recently about this like maximum amount that you need, this 20 grams and then plateau, and also this 3-hour refractory period, they weren't done with these concepts in mind. Many of them fed people a varying amount of protein every hour on the hour, and then use that to determine nitrogen balance, which in my opinion is not a particularly, we know that that's not as effective. As Tom mentioned, there was even a study done in the last few years which literally demonstrated that feeding somebody, a few groups of people, either a small amount every hour and a half, a moderate amount every 3 hours, or a large amount every 6 hours, the people with that moderate amount, about 20 grams of protein every 3 hours, did far better muscle protein synthesis than either the large amount spread over a large amount of time or the small amount spread over a small amount of time. So if we know that muscle protein synthesis is maximized in that 3-hour range, but most of the nitrogen balance studies are done with this 1-hour window, then I question whether there's a little bit more that we could learn. Do you get what I mean?
So are you saying that?
I'm saying that I think that we've gotten maybe some good ideas about how much protein we need based on nitrogen balance studies and these IAAO studies, these indicator amino acid oxidation studies. But I don't think they tell the full picture, because I feel like what they've studied, it provides nutrition to the body in a way that is not of maximum benefit according to what we know from other studies. So I would be curious to see, for example, a study on nitrogen balance that fed people in boluses every 3 hours, this, various amounts every 3 hours. Obviously for nitrogen balance study, we couldn't just do 20 grams for every group because we'd get basically the same results, but, see if using nitrogen balance over every 3 hours, if maybe 10 grams, 20 grams, 30 grams, 40 grams, 50 grams, usually these nitrogen balance studies go up to a really high amount because you're basically waiting to see when you get no more results, and see what the results from that are.
Right. So
see whether maybe they're a little lower than what. Sorry, what were you saying?
Okay, so just to be clear though, so say we're trying to maximize, let's say for argument's sake, what seems to be more optimal is, say, 4 meals a day, potentially 5 of 20 grams, right? Now, here's a question. Say I'm working with a climber who weighs 65 kilos, right? Well, let's say 60 kilos, right? And so they're roughly like 120 grams of protein a day, versus someone who is 80 kilos right?
Mm-hmm.
Not that much protein difference there. If both groups, both people had exactly the same protein intake, so in theory, the person who's 80 kilos is getting 120 grams of protein, but for both of them, you're giving them these 20-gram boluses over the 4 to 5 meals.
Right.
Would we see a difference? Would that bigger person be at a deficit at some point because they're not getting this so-called amount? Because if we know that protein synthesis is stimulated by this amount,
Mm-hmm.
is it what I'm trying to question now is, how do we start understanding the total daily protein amount?
Right. And yeah, it's a good question that I don't know if we have a perfect answer to yet. But what I will say is that we have, I think, enough information to know that their protein needs are very similar, and that the differences, I think, come down more to the rest of their diet, the calories they're consuming in particular. So, for example, there was a study recently that I did a quick little review on my blog that took two groups of people. They were both experienced weightlifters, which is important because novices and advanced weightlifters or athletes of any sort have different responses to training. When you first start training, you get a tremendous response, but then over time you start plateauing. But they're both experienced, so we should think that they have about the same response to training. But the difference was one group was very heavily muscled and the other group was not. So we had, on the one hand, a group of very large, strong people, and on the other hand, a group of just average. They weren't skinny by any means, but they were probably around a typical climber build. And then they fed them either 20 grams of protein or 40 grams of protein to measure the response. And the researchers' hypothesis was that the people that were more heavily muscled, I think they had on average 10 kilograms more muscle. So that's like 20 pounds more muscle. It's a large amount of muscle to have compared to a different person. What they hypothesized that this larger group would need more protein. They would get a greater benefit from 40 grams of protein versus the smaller group, who they thought would have a smaller protein requirement. And on the surface, it sounds like a sound hypothesis because, again, if you have to maintain 20 pounds more or 10 kilograms more of muscle, it seems like you're going to need more dietary protein to do that. But what they found was both groups had identical responses to both subsets of protein, both 20 grams and 40 grams. There was no difference. It didn't matter that one group had 20 pounds more of muscle. They got the same spike in muscle protein synthesis after consuming it as the smaller group. So to me, that kind of indicates, well, muscle is not perhaps the greatest indicator of how much you need. And I think one way to understand it is that, again, tracing back, we require a certain amount of protein to create this signal to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, right? But we don't actually put, like, if we have 20 grams of protein per meal, and let's say, just for the sake of argument, that we have 5 of those per day, so 100 total grams of protein, we don't use all that protein in our muscles. If we did, then every 5 days, roughly, we'd put on a pound of muscle. And getting big and strong would be no problem whatsoever, because every week, you'd be putting over a pound of muscle. Over, the course of a year, you could put on 50 pounds of muscle, and that would be an incredible transformation for anybody, even a novice. But that doesn't happen. We need 20 grams of protein to stimulate the muscles, but it's just a signal. How much of those amino acids we actually use, I think, is vastly smaller. And I think it's we have a large enough pool. Once we hit that 20 grams, we have a large enough pool of all the amino acids we need to fulfill the requirements, regardless of how much muscle you have to maintain. Whether you are, like a 110-pound ballerina or a 240-pound, football linebacker, it doesn't matter. You can meet all those needs with that. But what remains the same between those two individuals is the signal required to do it.
Right. So this is good, because from at the end of the day, we want to make this we want to alleviate any fears from people that this is a difficult thing, right?
Right.
And what Brian's saying is actually what is the determining factor of the difference between a ballerina and a linebacker, or whatever the example is, that there is a difference in energy requirements. Which,
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. The bigger you are, for sure, the more calories you need to maintain your body. And calories, really, when we're talking about whether you're building muscle or losing muscle, I don't want to say even more important than protein, but certainly of equivalent importance of protein is how many calories you're getting. If you are in a massive caloric deficit, it doesn't matter if you're eating 300 grams of protein, in an ideal dosing every day, you're not going to gain muscle, or you're not going to gain very much anyway. On the other hand, if you have a caloric surplus, then you're providing the energy to build muscle.
Right.
And you'll be able to. So when we look at the energy requirements of a 110-pound person versus a 240-pound person, they're very different. And that makes it, I think, it does make it a little more challenging to plan protein. As you said earlier, the large person has more leeway, or the bodybuilder has more leeway when it comes to getting that protein, which I think is true, because if you're eating, 4,000 calories, 5,000 calories a day worth of food, it's very easy to fit protein into all of that. But if you're eating 2,000 calories worth of food a day, then your meals are by nature smaller, and just getting, 20 grams of protein in a single meal can seem very intimidating. That might be a significant portion of what your meal looks like.
Right.
Especially if you're then splitting it out into, more meals than maybe you're used to eating.
Right. Now, just for people, so what we're trying to say is that in terms of the importance here, really, you should be looking at the importance of protein per meal, right? So we're looking at this minimum of 20 grams, and we want to try and spread those meals evenly over the day. Now, it's unlikely that anyone, unless someone who has a very specific training schedule, is going to be able to do any more than 5 meals a day.
Yeah,
now,
I agree. 5 is pretty much we could say 6 is like the maximum that a person could realistically do, but reality is often far short of expectation. And we can expect the average person to do no more than 5, because that gives you a lot more leeway.
Exactly. So what we do know is that it seems likely that 3 meals is better than 2, and quite likely that 4 meals is better than 3. And there may be some benefit to a 5th meal. So this 5th meal would be something like you've had dinner at 8 or 9 o'clock, and then you're going to be going to bed at like 10 or 11. And before you go to bed, you just neck down a protein shake. This could be benefit. This could be more benefit. But
right.
What I want to stress here is that we live in the real world. We don't eat meals that have specific amounts that we can easily measure. And the reason I say that is that it's one thing to look at what your meals contain to get a minimum of 20 grams, right? That's doable. You can do that with apps and calories and calorie counting apps and things like that. What I don't want you to feel, though, is that the average chicken breast that you buy, which is roughly 140 grams weight, you're looking at about anything from about 39 grams of protein up to about 50 grams of protein, depending on the size of this chicken breast. What we're not saying is that, like, you now have to be really pedantic and start chopping your chicken breast in half, because lo and behold, you're going to be wasting anything over 20 grams of protein. No. So if I'm working with someone and I say to them, okay, for your breakfast, I want you to have, let's say, 3 eggs and a bit of cottage cheese, or some toast or something that's going to bring you, or with some nuts or something that's going to bring you up to about 20 to 25 grams of protein, that you can do. If lunch, you can do the same, and you get roughly 20 to 25 grams, or let's say 30 grams of protein in your meal, that's great. You're spot on. Now, when you get to your dinner, I don't want you to be mucking around chopping up your chicken breast, right? You can do if you really want to, and divide it into a meal at, say, 8 o'clock, and then just before you go to bed, pop the next half of the chicken in. Maybe if you are really trying to optimize it, then yeah, that would be a great idea. But what I want you to understand is that you're not going to be so-called wasting that protein if you're going over that 20 to 25 grams. That is still going to be a factor in this total daily protein that you're consuming. There's a flip side to this, where people can come unstuck, is where they're consuming protein at the expense of other more important energy foods. If you listen to this, and most guys always do this, they shoot for the high end, and they think, oh, I'm going to go for 2.2 grams per kilogram, right? Just have a look at what those meals are going to look like, and have a look at what your requirements are for energy. And if you're eating protein at the expense of carbohydrates, this might not be a good idea.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, protein, it's important. But again, as we mentioned earlier, calories at the end of the day, that's just as important. Regardless of what your goal is.
Sure.
You need the calories to fuel. And if you're getting adequate protein, and then the rest of the protein that you're getting in a day is taking up calories in your diet that could be coming from carbohydrates or fat, something that's going to provide an actual source of energy, then you're not going to get as much benefit out of it. Right. So absolutely. When I at least say wasting protein, I don't. Mostly, it's just kind of a pedantic way of saying that you're going to be oxidizing it for energy. It's not really what we're consuming protein for. We have better sources of energy, carbohydrates and fat. We don't need protein to provide us with very much anyway, energy to, run the body. What we need the protein for is these structural roles, which again, for the purposes of our discussion is definitely muscles, but it's all the roles that we talked about at the very beginning, the enzymes and the bones and the brain and the mitochondria. We need protein for all of those. And anytime we're not using it for that, that's what I call wasting. It's not really, you're using it still. You're just not using it at its maximum potential.
Right. Now, I've just looked at the clock and we've reached an hour. So we're going to carry on, but if anyone wants to leave now, they can. There's a couple of other things that we want to cover. But one thing I want to just mention is that one thing that's useful is to understand as we pointed out, the quality of protein, and the quality of protein really is denoting mainly this leucine amount. Now, for people who are consuming potentially lower quality proteins, and that tends to be in the plant-based proteins. And any of you who are vegan, vegetarian, probably already know about trying to combine foods or trying to amplify the amount of food that you're eating to reach this sort of thing. I'm using this as a segue to something, Brian. So
okay, I'm with you.
is that there can be a case where you can do things to help you if you are consuming lower quality proteins. So for example, if we know that for muscle protein synthesis, that 20 grams of high quality protein contains enough leucine, roughly 2 grams, right?
Well, I think it'll depend on the person defining it, but I usually say 1.5 grams. If I can get 1.5 grams from 20 grams of protein, that is ideal. Right.
Okay. So say you're consuming a much lower quality protein, or say you're consuming much lower protein in total at this meal. This is where, interesting enough, if you were to put free leucine on top of that meal, this can potentially be useful. Now, I say this not to go encourage people to go out and buy free leucine. One, it tastes awful.
Terrible.
You can buy it in tablet form. But the reason I say this is that this can be sometimes quite a useful thing. So I'm kind of silly like this, but cleverly silly, is that I actually have leucine tablets in my bag. And the reason I have leucine tablets in my bag is sometimes when I'm stuck for a snack, I will actually eat the snack, which is by far not providing me enough protein, and then a couple of leucine tablets on top of it. Now, I do this because I'm a sports nutritionist, and I think it's kind of a cool thing to play around with. But the point being is that there is a potentiality to take foods that say, and this is mainly for people in the vegan vegetarian camp, because there is a way to try and optimize the meals that you have. And one way of doing it would be to use free-form amino acids, which now segues us to branch-chain amino acids, which which we abbreviate to BCAAs. So Brian, do you want to, I mean, we've got stuff to carry on, so let's maybe kind of carry on for half an hour the most, I think. But I think we should be able to cover this and wrap up soon. So let's go for BCAAs.
Yeah, and for those of you worried that we're going to ramble on forever for every episode, keep in mind we're novices at this. We're not novices at nutrition, but we're novices at holding a well-paced conversation. So we appreciate you listening on to what hopefully is not rambling, yes. But we promise that this is something we are going to improve at. Yeah, so it's BCAAs. They're kind of this supplement that it kind of refuses to die. They've been around forever, and they taste terrible. They're the most bitter amino acids that you can possibly take. But they've got quite a little cult following. And it's interesting because out of the BCAAs, it's really leucine that most people are interested in the effects of. The isoleucine and the valine, the other two branched-chain amino acids, they don't do that much as far as as far as the benefits that we're looking for from them. But the BCAAs, as Tom was mentioning, he supplements with this leucine during his smaller protein meals, which, if I can find a study, there's something about that. But I also want to say that your muscles aren't made just out of BCAAs, right? You need a diversity of amino acids. And so while leucine is the trigger, you need all of the amino acids in the end. And so, when Tom's supplementing with leucine, he's not doing it on a zero protein diet. He's doing it with protein, just maybe not enough to maximize that signaling. Right. And I think that's kind of the critical difference here. A lot of people take BCAAs, I think, as just by themselves, with the idea that they're going to get a similar benefit out of it as out of protein, but that is absolutely not the case. The best you can do if you just have free-form BCAAs or just take free-form leucine is the prevention of muscle protein breakdown, which isn't bad, certainly. Depending on your goals, that it's better to prevent muscle protein breakdown than to, accept it and have some muscle protein loss. But if you're an athlete and you're trying to recover optimally, then BCAAs aren't going to cut it. You need protein. You need whole protein. You need all of the amino acids, all of the essential amino acids, not just the branched chain ones.
Exactly. And I think what is the worry? So there's two things. People who take BCAAs, if they know a little bit about it, take it because they are trying to stop muscle protein breakdown during training, right? Mm-hmm. Really, from what I look at, is just not a concern.
Right. And better solved through other means.
Yeah, right. So the second thing is that if they're consuming BCAAs immediately after training in an effort to now stimulate muscle protein synthesis, they are indeed doing that, but as Brian's pointed out, you're not providing anything else. So the problem comes in is that if you are using BCAAs and assuming that this is a protein meal, you are fooled. And you're probably spending too much money on a supplement that really is, in the UK, we have a beer, or a lager rather, called Stella, which has fantastic marketing, but it's a terrible beer. Sorry, lager. It's the same thing. You really, look here, if you want a protein source that is easy for you to carry around and for you to drink, and funny enough, tastes better, then you want to use whey protein, right? The reason people drink BCAAs is either because they think it's doing something that a whole protein source isn't doing, and that's not correct, or they think it's convenient for them to take. Whey protein is just as convenient to take.
Right.
So
yeah, I think you've nailed that on the head. There's nothing that BCAAs can do for you that a normal protein supplement or just a whole protein cannot do better, tastier, and for cheaper.
There we go. That's the anti-marketing spiel. And just to be clear here, whey protein has all the BCAAs.
It does, as do any of the high quality sources, whether it's whey, casein, soy, brown rice protein, these pea protein, these all have ideal amounts of the BCAAs.
Right, exactly.
So
yeah,
doesn't matter if you're vegan or vegetarian, there are sources that are way better for that.
Yeah, exactly. We've got pea proteins, we've got rice proteins. The other thing for those who are wondering, if you're trying to stop muscle protein breakdown, you can eat some carbohydrate, because the muscle protein breakdown immediately stops in the presence of insulin. So insulin is a hormone that gets released when your pancreas senses blood glucose. So even the smallest snack is going to stop muscle protein breakdown. So
when you think of the physiology of muscle protein breakdown, why it happens, and maybe you do wonder why it happens because your body has low blood sugar. It needs to buoy those reserves, and our muscles can be, internally broken down into amino acids that can then be converted into glucose. So it only does it because the body needs glucose, and if you provide the body with glucose, carbohydrates, then you prevent it from happening in the first place, much more effectively than providing it with BCAAs, which are also going to, provide the same thing, just at a far less effectiveness.
Right. I think we've killed that one. Right.
I think so.
Now there were some questions that we got from the blog, from the website and Facebook, which were about BCAAs, and I think we've answered that for you. Hopefully, if it's still unclear, then let us know in the comment section. We're going to run through some things pretty quickly. So the anabolic window. Do you want to quickly nail that one?
Yeah, there's been a concept of, do you have to, of the anabolic window, which is, do you have to consume protein really soon after a workout? And the answer is no, unless you're fasted, unless you haven't eaten for hours. There was a meta-analysis by Alan Aragon and Brad Schoenfeld and one other whose name is missing right now, missing in my mind. But basically, they were able to demonstrate or show statistically through this meta-analysis that it's total protein matters way more than when you have that protein. And presumably, if you're having a lot of protein in the day, you're not having it all at once, as we mentioned. The analysis can't account for factors like that, or it didn't. But at the end of the day, you don't need to worry nearly as much about timing your protein after a workout or during a workout, or whatever that window means to you, so much as you just need to ensure that you are getting protein.
Right. And the other thing goes for consuming protein immediately before. There's no, I haven't come across anything in terms of it improving performance at all. So if you're choosing a meal to have before training or performance, the other things you should be thinking about is how it's going to feel in your stomach, and whether or not it's providing you the energy that you need for the duration. But that we'll cover in another podcast.
Yeah, exactly. When we think about timing, you know, I don't time my, personally, I don't time mine around my workouts. I time my work. It's nice being able to eat after you climb. So I will often time my meals for after I climb. And you know, if I have the option, I'll try to climb sometime during the day when I know that, you know, I'm going to be hungry right afterwards. But, you know, as far as like specifically talking about protein, I don't, I time my protein in my day. I don't time it around my workout. I just try to make sure that I'm getting adequate protein, and I don't worry as much about whether, you know, I'm having protein before, during, or after a workout.
Yeah. And so the big thing for this really is it's relative to you, to what's convenient for you, right?
Right, exactly. How does protein fit into your day? Don't feel obligated to, you know, bring a protein shake to the gym to consume right afterwards. Feel free to, you know, dally on home for an hour, prepare dinner, and then eat an hour and a half later. It'll be, you know, protein wise, you will be perfectly fine.
Exactly. Now, here's another one, which is one of my favorite studies because it's just crazy. So this was a study by Jose Antonio, and this was looked at really what happens if you feed guys, so resistance trained individuals, a stack of protein. So these guys were going from 2.5 to 3.3 grams per kilogram per day. And I know one of the guys managed to go to nearly 6 grams per kilogram, or it was a ridiculous amount. Anyway, the point of the study, they looked at it and they found there was no deleterious effects of consuming this amount of protein. Now, deleterious being there wasn't anything health related. So they had a previous study where they looked at blood lipids and clinical measures, and these as well in a study that was done acutely. So they were given this very high amount of protein for a short period of time. It had no effect on the kidneys. It had no effect on blood markers and things like that, which is very important because there's a lot of myths that go around that protein is dangerous for you. This study, these guys were eating 3 grams per kilogram per day for a year, and there was no health effects. The only thing they did complain about was they were very hot, and I think their bowel movements weren't so great. And also, it's incredibly difficult to eat 3 grams per kilogram. But anyway,
right.
These guys.
And I mean, that's a tremendous amount of protein. That's way more than most people are going to be even capable of eating without purposely trying. And it's not necessarily a big surprise that they had poor bowel movements after such a large amount. But the greater importance, as Tom mentioned, is there's really no danger to over-consuming protein. You know, a common myth is, yeah, that it's bad for the kidneys. And it's rooted in maybe a common sense idea, which is that, you know, if you have so much protein that, again, you're wasting it, you're excreting it, that the kidneys have to process all that, you know, and filter it, and maybe that takes a toll on them. But there has not been a single study, and there have been studies done on this, and there's never been a study that has demonstrated any noticeable effect on the kidneys, except for those who already have kidney failure or kidney disease of some sort. So if you have kidney problems, absolutely check with your doctor, you know, be safe. But if you don't have any known kidney problems, there is no risk to consuming too much protein. And as far as blood markers and all of the rest go, in general, assuming that the rest of the diet remains the same, they only improve.
Right. And this is something which is interesting as well, is that more and more studies are coming out looking at an older population, and the older population are being recommended almost the same amount of protein, roughly 1.5 to 1.6 grams per kilogram, as athletes.
Right.
And this goes back to what we were previously saying, is that it appears to be that by maximizing the amount of protein that you're getting throughout the day is beneficial. And the reason I say this is that as you get older, the it's not a case that you now need less protein, right? The mechanisms are still there, and in some sense, you might need a little bit more protein because you are less sensitive to this leucine. So in fact, your mom and dad might actually need a little bit more protein than you do if you're in your 20s.
Right, exactly. Think about that signal, and your hearing starts going out. It takes a louder signal to get the same message across. So, but I will say that from what we've seen, individuals who exercise consistently throughout their life, they have far less of this signal dampening than do individuals who are sedentary. So if you are, a 60-plus-year-old who has been sedentary most of their life and now has taken up climbing or some other activity, you might need to consume more protein than the typical athlete to get the same benefit. But if you've been exercising consistently since your youth, then you're probably going to be more or less okay with the same amount as somebody younger, because you haven't let those signals, what's the word I'm looking for? You have maintained your sensitivity to the signals.
Right. Yeah. So from a practicality point, a younger exercising person can do very well with this 20 grams of protein per meal. If you're in your late 60s, 70s, you might and have been sedentary for a while, then maybe you're looking at roughly 25 to 30 grams per meal.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, this is a big one because this is the one that people really get stuck on. Let's talk about quickly the protein and the acid-base balance.
Okay, yeah, this is an interesting one because I feel like people have kind of gone back and forth on it, but that was before we kind of understood what was happening. Protein, especially proteins that are rich in the sulfur-containing amino acids, which are most of the high-quality proteins, those sulfur-containing amino acids can acidify the blood to a certain degree. And as a result, our body pulls calcium from the bones. So there was a worry for a while that protein is a risk for osteoporosis, for loss of bone density. But the counter to that is that protein also increases intestinal absorption of calcium. So what it seems to be the case now is that, if anything, protein is actually going to increase your bone mineral density. And even if it does acidify your blood slightly, our body has very well-designed buffer systems, particularly pulling calcium from the bones. That sounds bad, but our bones are a reservoir of many minerals, not just calcium, but magnesium. Our sodium is stored on the bones. That's what keeps our blood sodium stable. So it's wrong to assume that the calcium that goes in our bones should stay on those bones for all time. Calcium is also stored on the bones as a short-term reservoir for purposes exactly of what we've just described, which is preventing, buffering the blood and making sure that it stays at that 7.2 pH. So overall, don't need to worry about the acidification due to protein. If anything, protein is going to increase your calcium retention and calcium balance in your body.
Yep. And there's a recent meta-analysis or paper looking at this, 2013, and they really summed it up saying variations in human diets across a plausible range of intakes have shown to have no effect on blood pH. Now, we do know that you can change the pH of your urine pretty quickly. If you have a green smoothie, it will make your urine more alkaline.
But that's exactly what the urine's for.
Yeah, but your blood is very tightly controlled. And carrying on from this quote, it says, consistent with the lack of a mechanistic basis, long-term studies of alkalizing diets have shown no effect on the age-related change in bone fragility. Consequently, advocating the consumption of alkalizing foods or supplements and or removing animal protein from the human diet is not justified by the evidence accumulated over the last several decades.
Right.
So it really is not a case that the more protein you're eating, the more acidic you're going to get in the blood, and that's going to leach and cause weakness in the bones. That's blatantly false. We've shown that is not the case. We will talk about in another podcast, maybe more on the acid base bit, because there is a case that acidity in your system can affect performance, but this is not going to be driven by protein predominantly. So anyway, we'll leave that for another time. I think let us have a look here. Before we do a summary, Brian, of everything, let's just have a look if there's a question. Is there a question from someone you want to answer particularly?
Yeah. I think, in the future, when we're better about our time management, we'll try to answer questions kind of during their own section. But for this purpose here, I think maybe we should, include them in this discussion. Okay, this is a good one. Let me pull up the question itself. I don't have it in my notes. The question was, and there are two kind of related questions, so I'll say both of them. The first one's from Jerry. I got it through Facebook, which is, are protein requirements the same for a male teenage athlete who trains for climbing 15 to 18 hours a week as an adult? And the second one is from Jura from Denmark, I believe. And that is sufficient protein intake equally important during longer rest periods? So like 24 hours after climbing and so on. So I'll answer them just in part. So are male teenage athletes protein needs the same? Well, the few studies we have on it, because unsurprisingly, sports nutrition studies are kind of few and far between to begin with, and then ones on adolescents are even fewer. But what we do have seen is that they are probably pretty similar, at least from a nitrogen balance perspective. And the signaling is probably going to be pretty similar as well. Children are smaller than adults, but you also have to consider that children are growing a lot more. They have a lot more protein need than adults. So even if they have less muscular need for protein, they have significantly more bodily need just across all the systems of their body. And so I think at the end of the day, even though we can't conclusively answer this question, their needs are going to be pretty similar to adults. So there's no reason, for them to consume any less. This is for a teenager. Obviously, getting 100 to 120 grams of protein for a 7-year-old, that's not practical. Yeah. But when we're talking about children and growing children in general, I don't think sports nutrition, as we're talking about it, like these details, these nitty-gritty bits, I don't think they really become something that children should be focused on until roughly teenage age anyway. We don't want to create weird attitudes about food and build in these dysfunctional eating patterns at a young age.
I think Brian, we'll do a whole podcast on maybe youth nutrition.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's a good topic. It's a good topic to talk about. But for this question, bottom line, if they're a teenager and they're eating the same amount of food as an adult, then certainly they are going to benefit from the same protein requirements. As for whether protein intake is equally important during long rest periods, I would say it is. First of all, muscle protein synthesis is elevated for upwards of 48 hours after your last workout. So it's not just after a day, it's like 2 days. It's a 2-day time period. And then even after that protein is going to prevent muscle protein loss. So it's going to help you prevent losing any muscle that you've accrued.
Right. And I think that's a big takeaway from this, is that actually you will find, and I really stress this, and I think for those listening who try this, is that if you can get your protein intake consistent, and you're looking at a consistency of weeks, really to try and get these goals and as best as you can, you're gonna feel better and you're gonna perform better.
Right.
I've seen it with the clients that I work with, and I'm sure Brian has as well. Consistency with this sort of thing is really the takeaway message. And the consistency is based on how you can do it. Like, how do you position your meals? What sort of foods do you eat? What is convenient for you? If you're someone who finds it convenient to have a protein shake at lunch because you work in a busy office environment, then do that. If you're somebody who has no need for taking whey protein because you have the time and the schedule that allows you to eat full meals, then do that. You know, if you're training and you want to take whey protein to have after your training, then do so. You know, at the end of the day, you need to look at what you currently eat. We've told you the guidelines here in terms of a minimum, you know, try and get this 20 to 25 grams per meal. Use a tool like Chronometer or MyFitnessPal or something like that to look at what you're currently eating, what you're habitually eating, and scale things up. If you're noticing that you're habitually eating, let's say 3 eggs and a piece of toast every morning, put that into one of these calculators, see where you're falling short, and maybe you can have half a scoop of whey protein with that breakfast, or better, have a 4th egg, or have some cottage cheese, or have some cheese, or other
some milk. Yeah,
there we go. Exactly, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
yeah,
protein supplements, they are, by in the very name, they are supplements. You don't need to think about them only in terms of a complete meal, you know, like replacing all of the protein in a meal. You are more than welcome to use a small amount just to get, you know, whatever protein you need in excess of what you're getting from the rest of your diet for that particular meal.
Yeah, and you know, even in terms of a budget, you know, if you're a young student or something, whey protein is a very high, if not the high quality protein for very little money. So, you know, if you're trying to get your meals to be balanced and you're struggling, then certainly a whey protein and having, you know, half a scoop or adding something into the meals. I wouldn't recommend mixing it in, you know, eggs and whey protein.
Yeah, do it in a culinarily appropriate way for sure.
So, you know, that's the useful thing. So, like Brian, I don't think we have. Do you want to cover the random study we want to put in? Do you want to do that quick?
I feel like we should. For those of you who were only interested in the protein, I don't think we're going to talk much more about it. If we do, it'll just be a kind of a quick summary of the key points. But one thing we want to do in every one of these podcasts is talk about, kind of review a recent piece of research that is practical to climbers. Whether it's practical from a nutrition standpoint, or in this case, kind of understanding the hormonal physiology of climbing. So would you like to introduce the study, Tom?
Yeah, so this is a study with the title of "The Effect of Potential Fall Distance on Hormonal Response in Rock Climbing." And it basically was a study looking at literally the hormonal response of falling from different clipping heights.
Right. So exactly. They had a group of 9 advanced female rock climbers, and they were indoors on, I think it's about a 25-meter wall, maybe a 20-meter wall. And they were instructed to either clip all the bolts on the way up or to clip half of the total bolts. I think the way it was in particular is they clipped the 2nd, 3rd, 5th, and then every other bolt after that. So they did it in a way that was presumably safe, though certainly more fear-racking.
Yeah, I mean, you can't carry on, Brian. You take this one. So
okay, so what they were specifically looking at the catecholamines, which are dopamine, norepinephrine, or noradrenaline, and epinephrine, or adrenaline, depending on what you want to call it. And they found that the group that clipped half of the bolts had a 57% higher release of total catecholamines, and specifically had a significantly higher norepinephrine release and dopamine release. Epinephrine, serotonin also increased, but the results were not as significant, although epinephrine did increase by 84% larger, so it's quite a large release. But as they explained in it, epinephrine release is it's highly variable depending on the individual, because basically we release adrenaline, we release epinephrine when we're surprised by something, and so the response that each climber had on the wall kind of depended on, presumably how surprised they were, going to a hold, or if they didn't have reason to get the blood pumping, then they did not have the same release of epinephrine. Although one interesting thing was the climbers who only climbed led indoors and did not have a lot of outdoor lead experience had significantly more adrenaline release than the ones that did have regular outside leading experience.
Right. So what can we what can we actually take away? What can we glean from this study?
So, I mean, I guess in one sense, the results of the study are kind of a no-brainer. It's the hormone pattern that we're seeing, this increased release of the catecholamines, is consistent with increased anxiety. The climbers who were only allowed to cliff half as much of the protection and had to potentially take a fall of double the distance if they, failed at a certain point of the route, they had far more anxiety on the route. So that's kind of the objective. What we've discovered, climbers are more anxious when they have less protection. As for how that kind of translates to reality, one of the interesting things about anxiety is it's not just, it is mental, it's a mental construct, but it affects your performance. It has physical consequences. All these hormones, they affect your perceived exertion. The more anxious you are about a climb, the harder that climb is going to seem, even if it's the exact same climb. So if you were to do something, clipping none of the bolts, I obviously don't recommend that, versus half of them, versus all of them, versus top roping it. It's if it was your first go on it, if you had no experience with that climb, you are going to find the top roped version of it way easier than the free soloing version of it. Even if you don't have any utility from the rope or whatever, even if otherwise the conditions are the exact same. One of the ways that this was demonstrated in the study was that the climbers on the half who clipped half had a greater amount of lactate in their muscles right after the climb. So what they perceived had happened, and they also moved a lot slower on it. So essentially, the climbers who did not have as much protection, they spent more time on the holds. They spent more time trying to figure out where they were going to go next. They were much more careful about it. And as a result, they ended up using far more carbohydrates. They had a much greater lactate production. And the lactate production is going to be a consequence of carbohydrate metabolism within the muscles. And that lactate production is also presumably, it's not a direct correlation here, but it does correlate to fatigue in the long run. I want to be clear that the lactate itself is not fatigue related. It's corollary to it. But when you're producing a lot of lactate, you're using a lot of carbohydrate energy, you're driving the pH of the muscles down, you're going to become more fatigued quicker.
And what an excellent segue for our next podcast. So, we've hit the 1 hour 36 minutes plus the rambling we did for like 15 minutes before. So
right.
As we've said, as Brian mentioned earlier, this is our first attempt at this. So we will endeavor to make this a much shorter show. And let us like it. If people like it this length, then let us know, and we'll carry on.
Please do. Please let us know if you enjoyed our ramblings for 1 hour and 36 minutes, or whether you'd maybe liked us to, I think in particular, just to maybe brainstorm very, very quickly with you on the air, so our listeners have an idea of how we approach this. Perhaps we could be more specific. We talked a lot about protein. Protein's a gigantic topic, and we tried to cover all of it in one podcast, which was maybe a little bit, I don't know, maybe we were overconfident in our ability to summarize a complex topic in 30 minutes, which is what I estimated how long that discussion would take. I was way off on that mark. So
yeah, and my notes, my page of notes is far longer. So that we've got a lot more stuff to cover. We've got
there are topics we didn't even get to on protein. So perhaps one thing is if we could dial it down into maybe a couple of specific topics on these large topics. And to be certain, not every topic we're considering covering is as big as protein. But we're thinking about carbohydrates for the next episode, and perhaps it would be better to look at a few specific instances or a few specific topics within the carbohydrate spectrum, rather than try to tackle it all in 1 hour to 2 hour episode. That's an idea, but I hope everyone I hope you were able to bear with us. I hope it was enjoyable, and definitely please let us know what you would like to hear. Topics. Please give us your questions, particularly questions that maybe we didn't cover about this episode, protein related questions. We will do our best to answer them, either on the air or personally. I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's been great. So Brian, again, do you want to just say where people can find you?
Yeah. So my blog, where I spend the majority of my time writing, climbingnutrition.com. I've tried to make it pretty simple and pretty obvious what it is I write about. I write about climbing and nutrition, climbingnutrition.com. So you can find me there. I try to put out articles pretty consistently, specifically pertaining to how you can improve your climbing through good sports nutrition or better sports nutrition.
Good. And so where are you actually based?
I'm in Boulder, Colorado, kind of climbing hub within the United States. Yeah, looking at a sunny day after a bunch of rain. And you, Tom?
So I spend I don't have as much free time to blog, but most of the time I'm with clients or in climbing centers. So you can find me at useful.coach, and that actually is the URL. If you just search for Tom Herbert or Useful Coach or Useful Space Coach or Tom Herbert and Coach, I tend to come up somewhere in the results. But useful.coach is where you'll find me. Since I'm also a trainer and a coach, I provide services for that, and all the details are on my website. For the Climbing Science Cast or the ClimbSci Cast or CSC, whatever you prefer, we're going to have a page up, and we're going to probably have a Facebook group, and we're going to have all this paraphernalia where you can contact us. But the main thing, if you do have questions that you want for the show, I recommend you to go to the climbingnutrition.com Facebook group or climbingnutrition.com, and there is a page there that you can actually ask questions. So yeah. Oh, and I'm based in London, UK, and it's like 10 o'clock here, and it's cold, and we've just left Europe.
Well, yeah. The way to end it on a depressing note, Tom.
Who knows? Whey protein might be cheaper. Who knows? Who knows?
Who knows? Anyway, yeah, it's true.
Brian, thank you so much. I'm so glad that we kicked this off. It has been a pleasure, and I look forward to the shows coming up. I look forward to it as well, Tom. I had a great time talking with you, and yeah, carbohydrates next time, maybe a more specific topic within that general concept, and we promise we will improve. But thanks for joining us. Thanks, guys. Thanks. Cheers.